Do you guys remember this ship? Well, we're going to build one. Well, hey guys, and welcome back to another Interested in Modeler. So in this video, I have a unique model to share with you. This is going to be a replica of a ship seen in the Season 2 of Buck Rogers. This was flown by the character Hawk. And this is one of a few models that I have here now that I've downloaded for printing and building. A couple of other models that I have include the shuttlecraft, or the shuttle from the original Battlestar Galactica series, as well as the hammerhead seen in Rogue One. Now, one of the things about this model is that there aren't a lot of parts. One thing that I found when I started into 3D printing is I would go to these websites you can buy files from, and quickly was overwhelmed, first of all, because there's a lot of stuff out there, and you start going, man, I want this model and I want that model, but when you look up the inventory of parts that some of these models can have, man, there can be quite a few. This one in particular only had about 15, 16 parts or so it wasn't that complicated to get printed and to get ready for this video. And the model can be printed, and this has been designed to be printed up to about 3 feet in length. I neither have the capability of printing something that large, nor I even have any space to store that or display it. So my intention here was to size it down and to get close to the scale of the monogram kits of the Thunderfighter and the Marauder. Model turned out a little bit larger than that. This model measures now with about an 8-inch length and a 10-inch wingspan. As to what scale this is, modeler Ernest Thomas helped give me an approximation. He asked, as I post this on Facebook, if I could give him an estimate of what size figure would be appropriate for this model. And based on that, he estimates this to be about 1/96 in scale or so. Now, let's take a minute just to reminisce here about Buck Rogers for a second. Buck Rogers is a show that aired in the late 70s, early 80s. It ran for 2 seasons, and it kind of reminds me of Space 1999 in the sense that you have 2 shows here that aired for 2 seasons, and each season is way different from the other. It's like having 2 different shows. At least with Space 1999, some of the changes work there, but with Buck Rogers, man, this is an example of what happens when studio executives call all the shots. It really didn't work all that great. I thought the first season was much more interesting, and the second season I think they wanted to make it to like Star Trek, where they did some planet hopping. So not a lot about the second season that I really enjoyed, but one character that stood out to me was the character of Hawk. His species was related to birds, and he flew a fighter that was shaped like a bird. It had retractable wings and claws. And so I found it to be a very unique and interesting design. So it's something I wish they had made a model for, but they never did that. And certainly through the years, there have been some garage kits and those types of things. But when I saw this on CGtrader, I just had to get a hold of it, and I thought it'd be an interesting project to share with you guys here. Now, as you know, I like to use a lot of reference pictures to go from, and there aren't a lot of reference pictures of the original studio miniature. But if you go to a website called buyyourcommand.net, I'll post a link to this below, you'll find about 13 pictures of the original studio model. Let's go and take a look at a couple of them. So you see that the body is painted kind of like an almond color. What's interesting is that the detailing at the tip of the wings now, or at least the ends of the wings, are painted to make them look or resemble feathers, which is going to be interesting to try to replicate here. Well, one other thing I wanted to add to this model is a figure. The designer did not include one, but yet the cockpit can accommodate a figure. So I went online to try to search for a pilot figure and came across this one on Thingiverse. I'll go ahead and place the link below. This is a cool figure. It is outfitted with a number of different uniforms, one of which has the helmet that you see here in this diagram. And this again is a picture of Hawk. You'll see his head is covered with feathers, and my idea here is to paint those feathers onto the helmet. Now the files do come with windows that can be placed into the frame, but I'm not going to be using those. My experience with flat pieces like this that are printed very thin and flat is, unfortunately, as the resin cures, they tend to curl. So I am not going to be using those. I'm just going to be using clear, thin styrene plastic for the windows. And I'm going to be also applying a little bit of Tamiya smoke to those windows. So you'll be able to see that there's a pilot sitting there. You'll see some of the detail I'll be painting onto his head. But because the windows are going to be slightly smoked, I'm not going to make them too dark, you're not going to see a tremendous amount of detail. So I think this figure is going to work out for what I need here. All right, well, before I begin, just a few other things to note here. I will give you a brief look at the parts that I printed for this project, and then we'll move on to assembly. Now, the pieces, as they join together, many of those adjoining surfaces are flat. And the one thing I've learned about 3D printing is that unless the flat surface is right up against the build plate, I find that as they print, because you do have to add supports to these surfaces, they can be a little uneven and a little irregular. So I got to be sure that I sand those nice and smooth. That way we get as tight a fit as possible and therefore avoid any large gaps that I'll have to fill. So once the model is assembled, I will fill any gaps that we need to before moving on to painting and detailing. As for replicating the look of the feathers now, or at least that paint scheme that makes it look like feathers, I do have an idea on how to approach that. It's going to be a similar technique that I think will work here as simulating wood on a piece of plastic. So that should be interesting to work on. The other thing I want to make note of here now are the claws. Now the claws are small, so they aren't strong enough to support the weight of the ship, nor are they designed in a flat configuration anyway. And even if they were, I doubt if the ship would be balanced enough to support on those little claws. But I do want to display the ship with the claws, and I'm just trying to think ahead here because if the model comes out well enough, I do want to be able to transport it to model shows, maybe even to Wonderfest. So to avoid any breakage during transport, I think it'd be best to attach the claws with magnets instead, and that also gives me the ability to replicate them in case they break for any reason. It'll be easy to reproduce those and reattach them. All right, well, that is all I think I wanted to mention here. It should be a fun project to work on. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay guys, well here are all the pieces. There are 16 total. I have them arranged here as they will be assembled together. Let's begin with the front section of the cockpit. So this printed out well. One exception, however, was the bottom half of this instrument panel. It didn't quite come out as it was supposed to. Once I cured the piece, what you could see were just some extra layers that weren't adhered together, and I just snipped away with some clippers there and sanded it down a little bit. Not a big deal because you're not going to be seeing any of that through the windows. You can see the seat includes some seat belts there. And here's another look at the screens of the instrument panel. You can see now on the back side there is the screen for the back part of the cockpit. So these two pieces join together like that. And we've got some nice deep panel lines here on the surface of the hull, which I'll be using a wash to enhance. Alright, moving now to the midsection, which is the wingspan, and I'll just go through one side since the parts are the same. This is the very middle section here. You can see the detailing on the bottom. We got the middle part of the wing. These are the panels here that we will be detailing. And the very tip of the wing here. This is now the tail section. Some of the detailing here on the bottom side. And these are the frames now that go over the cockpit. Again, I'll be using some clear styrene for the windows. And this is now the figure that I printed. You can see the helmet there that I'll be painting the feathers on. And then we've got the two claws. And you see what I mean now. These are not sturdy enough to support this fighter. But this is the area now that I'll be putting the magnets on, and these attach right into here. Now if you don't want to deal with the claws, the model does come with these two doors that enclose that section. I just wanted to print these out just to show you that they are available. And now that I think about it, just one other thing I wanted to show you. This again is one of the flat surfaces I was talking about. This was not against the build plate. This particular piece had to be printed in this orientation, so neither this surface or these surfaces here were against the build plate. So they're a little rougher versus, say, something like this, which was right up against the build plate. You can see how flat and smooth that is. Now, as for adhesive, super glue tends to work pretty well for this type of resin, but I've had some issues with super glue coming undone, and so just to be sure I get a good strong hold, I'm going to be using this two-part epoxy here instead. Alright, let's go ahead and move forward then. Now, before I do anything else, I need to actually do a little sanding along the edges of the pieces that were printed flat against the build plate. Note how you see a little excess resin along the edge of this piece? Well, this is called an elephant foot, and it's one consequence of printing flat up against the build plate. It's thought that the primary reason for this is the high temperature of the print bed, which is necessary for initial layer adhesion. The heat can keep the bottom of the layers in a semi-melted state, leading them to spread under the weight of upper layers. Now, there are settings you can adjust to prevent this, but I've actually not gotten around to making any adjustments, particularly because I don't print flat against the plate very often. In fact, it's generally recommended against doing so because of other factors as well that can lead to added stress and poor adhesion to begin with. But in this case, I decided to do so because these pieces are lightweight, and I really wanted to keep the sides completely free of any defects from supports. In this case, the excess resin is easily taken care of by use of wet sanding and sanding sticks. Wet sanding, as with any other resin, along with wearing a mask, is highly recommended because you just don't want to breathe in any of the dust. As you can see, this took care of the issue, and it took less than 10 minutes of time. Well, I stopped here now to rethink how to approach painting these panels. I have 42 panels that I have to paint with this technique I'm going to be using here. And at first I had in mind to assemble everything and then proceed from there. But I really do think it'd be easier to do it unassembled just to gain better access to these panels. One thing I did want to point out here, a few of the pieces, well, actually just a couple pieces, I had to deepen up the panel lines because they were a little shallow. And one way to do that, of course, is with the scribing tool, which can be a little nerve-wracking sometimes to use. But this technique I'm using here involves using Dymo tape. This is tape that's used for label makers. You might recall you'd stick it in a label maker and it would emboss letters onto this stiff material. And because of its rigidity, it works well as a guide for scribing. You just put it onto the surface there next to the line that you want to scribe, and it is a perfect tool for this. And it is particularly great when you're trying to scribe around curved surfaces. All right, let me go ahead and proceed with this, and we'll see how it goes. Well, before showing you how this technique works, I thought I would show you the end results first, and I'm really happy the way this is looking. Let's take a look again at the studio model. Again, these are the panels that line the edges of the wings, and when I first saw those panels, it instantly reminded me of the technique you use to simulate wood grain on plastic. So this is a technique I first used with the Invisible Man build. If you recall, that diorama comes with a table and a bookcase, and this is how they turned out. And I think the technique works really well to simulate wood. So let's go ahead and get to the demo. I'm going to start with a different piece. I just got to prep a few things here first, and then we'll get started. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start with this piece here, and so I'm going to work my way from the middle on out. The reason I decided to go with this is because I do have to attach this piece to here, and you can see this is one of the gaps I need to fill. Now, the color that I've sprayed onto here is not the final color. This was the color I initially was going to go with because I was going by just the reference pictures, but I decided to screen the episode, and I'm glad I did because it appears lighter on screen. So I do have that color already chosen, but since this is already painted, I'm going to go ahead and finish this here, and the top and the bottom. I'll go ahead and glue it together and fill in that gap with putty, and then spray paint it once more with this tan color before applying the final color that I'm going to be using for the rest of the ship here. Alright, let's go ahead and get to the technique now, and it's not very complicated. It also doesn't take a long time, particularly here because the panels are smaller. But I first begin by painting on a flat black. And this is followed by a light color, which in this case I'm using ivory. Then I start in on the browns, first beginning with a burnt sienna. I then move on to a burnt umber, and as you can see as I'm applying now, the strokes are all in the same direction. I then move on to khaki. And again, adding in some burnt umber here. However, this is the color from Model Air, and their Model Air collection tends to be thinner, and particularly this color is almost like adding in a dark brown wash. I then varied things a little bit further, adding back in a lighter shade by mixing ivory with khaki. And this is how it turns out. Alright, what we have here now are the three parts glued together, and you can see that I have filled in the gaps with Vallejo's plastic putty. The gaps are a little larger at the bottom, so I will be adding a second application of the putty to fill in just a little bit more. This unevenness is due to some irregularity of those flat surfaces that I was talking to you about, but I do think it will turn out okay once I'm done with it. Alright, just another look at the final piece here. These are the tips of the wings now that I just finished, and very pleased with how this technique ended up replicating the look of those panels that you see on the miniature. Well, before moving on, I wanted to show you one other thing here. I didn't realize that this panel on this wing extends to this section here, so I did have to paint that in. And you'll notice now there is a seam here where the two pieces meet. So I'm going to go ahead and glue these together right now and kind of see how the seam is looking. I sanded it so it could be as tight as possible, but I do think I need to put some plastic putty here. Well, here are the wingtips now, and there was no easy way to put these together except to hold them in place for about 5 minutes while the two-part epoxy held and cured. I am determined not to use super glue, particularly with these pieces. I don't think super glue would be the best adhesive to hold them together, so I'm going to go ahead and give this some time to dry. I'll let these sit here for a few hours before we get to filling in those seams and doing some light sanding. Well, I thought I'd take a second just to show you how the rest of the model is coming along here. I now have the tail section glued onto the main body. This is what it looked like last night as I was allowing it to set and cure. This morning I was able to fill in the seams with plastic putty. And just now I finished spraying on this color onto all of the areas that I had filled in with plastic putty. So this is all ready to proceed now with applying the final color. Yeah, and it's unfortunate I didn't spot this any sooner. I would have done all of this prior to painting these panels here at least. But, well, that's just kind of the way it goes. Well, I'm going to go ahead and set this aside, and I guess this is a good time to take a break from this, and I'll be right back. Well, after coming back and working on the seam, it turns out it wasn't too hard to conceal this. I started off with just a little light sanding, used plastic putty, but in this case I ended up brushing the plastic putty on. I figured this way I would be able to apply the putty and provide some very light texture that is similar to the paint strokes that were there for the panels to begin with. And once that was dried, I ended up using the same browns, and it turned out well. Well, as expected, and it wasn't something I was looking forward to doing, masking all of these panels was a bit tedious, but I have it all done now. And I'm ready to apply the final color for the ship. So that color is actually going to be this light buttermilk for Americana. It's a warm white color, and I added just a little bit more brown, just a few drops of burnt umber and a brown color to give it a more brownish tone. Now when I apply the paint, I'm going to do so with the wings still detached, because once I'm ready to peel off all of this masking tape, it'll be easier to do so with these things apart. And then we'll glue everything together. I will then apply a gloss coat onto the surface because I have a bit more handling to do, as well as to apply a brown wash to bring out more of the panel lines there. And I want to draw your attention now to the nose of the craft. You'll notice here in the reference picture that the nose is actually a white color, or just brighter than the rest of the hull. So I think for this I'll be using Monument Hobbies Bright Ivory. Okay, well, jumping ahead here now, you can see I've already applied the wash, and I have to admit I was a little panicked trying to take the wash off. It was not coming off as easily, and I think two reasons for that. One, I might have too much paint in that wash mix that I made, but the second thing, which I think is more likely, is that I ended up using this Creatix water-based gloss coat, which works fine, but I'm not sure it works as well as an enamel, which is what I typically put on a model. I just ran out of this stuff with regard to taking off a wash. So I'll have to experiment a little bit with that and stick to an enamel gloss coat, I think, when it comes to washes, but or at least any extensive washes like this. So as you can see now, I already have one wing glued on, and I'm going to go ahead and glue on this other one and let this set overnight. So when I get back to the bench in the morning, we'll get started with a bit more weathering with a Tamiya weathering kit and a few other things. So the next morning before starting work on the ship, I looked again at the reference photos, and doing so made me think that the ship would look better if I had added more panel lines. I wish I had done this earlier on with my scribing tool, but since the model was already assembled, I felt the easiest thing to do was to pencil them in. I started with a ruler, but turned to the Dymo tape again, which worked great, especially with hard-to-reach places. Next, I moved on to some weathering, and I continued to use the Dymo tape for this as I applied pigment from the Tamiya weathering kit. Now, the scorch marks that you do see around the turbo lasers, however, were done not with the Tamiya weathering kit, but with my airbrush. This is something I've become more confident doing now, especially because I have good 0.3 and 0.2 airbrushes now. Well, before doing any of the weathering, I actually finished the engines first, and for this I chose to use Model Colors Oily Steel. This is a nice color, a little different than just regular steel. It has a more bluish tone to it. After it dried, I ended up using their black wash. And after that was dry, I just used their silver to dry brush onto these parts and bring out some of this detail that you see here. Also took my airbrush to dirty up the insides of the tail just so it didn't look too clean. So I'm going to finish this up and add just a little more weathering here and there, but what I want to move on now to are the frames for the cockpit. I think that's going to be a little bit of a challenge to get the windows in place, so let's go ahead and finish that up. Well, really not much to show here, just a matter of painting this figure up, but I think the figure worked out well with the helmet. As you can see, I just had to paint it white and just use some gray just to add some streaks there, but most prominent are the two dark feathers that come up above his eyebrows. And so that combined with the black suit makes for a pretty convincing looking figure of Hawk. Okay, so I have a couple of choices for our windows. I have a 0.005 inch thickness and a 0.1 thickness clear styrene. And this is what the 0.005 inch looks like. It's very, very thin. So I'm not sure if that's too thin, but one thing I have to bear in mind is I just don't have a lot of clearance here. I'm thinking what I might do to glue our windows into place, because we can't use super glue, is to glue some very thin styrene on the roof here and along here and here. I do have some 0.04 inch thickness plastic styrene for that. What I'm going to work with first are the thin windows. If they're too thin, I'll move on to the other one. But yeah, just don't have a lot of clearance between the roof here and Hawk's head. Okay, well, these are now complete. The other window is still drying, but there really was no easy way to do this. I just had to try to trace what I needed onto the clear styrene and cut them out and glue them into place. I actually ended up using small amounts of 2-part epoxy on these windows so that they would stay in place for sure. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and glue these in place, and I have one last thing to do. Okay, well, we're at the final step here now, and I've saved for last the landing gear or the claws. And what I have put in place now are 2 magnets. These are 5mm by 1mm thickness magnets. And so we have 2 inside the ship, and we'll be gluing some adjoining magnets onto each of the claws here. So I actually want to thin this down a little bit as much as I can so that these don't stick out too far, because we're adding 1mm here and 1mm in that ship. So I'll finish up this last step now and show you the completed project in a second. Alright guys, so here we now have the completed replica of Hawk's ship from the 2nd season of Buck Rogers. Based on the size of the figure, this ship is approximately 96 in scale, measuring about 8 inches in length, and has about a 10.5 inch wingspan. The model's design includes a lot of nice details that make the ship quite impressive once it's complete. Let's go and review the build. So the model comes with 16 parts that were easy to assemble, but most of my time, however, was not spent with putting the ship together, but rather with painting and detailing. One part of this task involves replicating the unique paint scheme that was applied to the panels that line the aft section of the wings. Apparently, the purpose for this pattern was to replicate or resemble the look of feathers. Upon examining the reference pictures I found on a site called buyyourcommand.net, the paint scheme instantly reminded me of a technique that I had learned for simulating the look of wood grain on styrene plastic. It's something that I used when building the Invisible Man diorama several years ago. The technique involves hand brushing and layering up to 6 shades of brown, which when complete results in the various shades, lines, and grain seen with wood. I first tested the technique, and it looked really close to what's seen on the studio model, but I did add a few modified brushstrokes in order to recreate the feathered appearance that is seen on the miniature. The method itself is easy and quick to do, but in this case it had to be done to 42 separate panels. This involved a lot of masking both when painting the panels and then covering them again for the application of the final hull color. Although this sequence was time-consuming, it worked well in the end because hand brushing and masking don't always end up with nice crisp lines. Masking them over and spraying on the final color this way resulted in cleaning up a lot of that unevenness. As mentioned, assembly is very straightforward and the model is nicely engineered so that the major seams coincide with the hull's panel lines. Filling in any gaps was easy with the use of plastic putty. As for the panel lines, the model has quite a few which print out fairly well, but I deepened some of them using a scribing tool, and these were further enhanced with a wash. Although there are numerous panel lines, the model is also missing quite a few as well, particularly along the aft section. Once the model was painted, I decided on penciling in more of those panel lines prior to weathering, and I'm happy that I did. The model did not include a figure, and I happened to find this one on Thingiverse which really fit the bill. Painting the helmet to resemble the feathered head of the character worked perfectly, and it really adds a nice touch. As for the cockpit itself, there's not a lot of interior detailing, which is okay because you can't really see much of it to begin with. The files did include windows for print, but I chose not to use those because of my past experience with printing thin, flat pieces. They tend to warp and distort after the curing process, so to avoid this, I chose to use 0.005-inch clear styrene instead, which was easy to trim and cut. At this size, the window frames are a little delicate, but with careful handling, I had no problems completing the task. The final step was to paint up the claws, and I chose to attach them with magnets to make them easy to remove as I anticipate taking the ship to a model show or two. And this puts my mind at ease because doing it this way helps to avoid any potential damage to the landing gear when transporting the model. So as mentioned at the beginning of the video, this ship is a very unique and interesting design, and it will sure make a nice addition to my Buck Rogers model collection. Now, many of you have probably already noticed it's not a screen-accurate model kit, and I have to admit that I really didn't pay close attention to how accurate the model was or the files were, both when purchasing the model as well as during the printing process. Really, I hadn't looked at any reference photos prior to starting the project, or getting close to starting the project anyway, and really was just basing everything on what I had remembered from seeing on a TV show. It just simply looked right to me. But once I dove into this, I started to look more closely at the reference photos, and you can start to realize pretty quickly that there are just a lot of discrepancies from the miniature. Take, for example, the cockpit. You can see here that the configuration of the cockpit and the windows is completely different to that of the studio model, and I'm afraid the same can be said regarding the placement of the panel lines as well as greeblies and other details. Now, I have to say, I have no idea what it takes to design a model on a computer. It takes a certain skill set, which no doubt this gentleman who produced these files definitely possesses, and I imagine for him it wouldn't really take much to alter a few things and make these modifications. I'll reach out to him and see, at least to let him know what I've come across, but either way, I don't have any plans on doing another one. I made a decision early on as I was looking at pictures and seeing that there were discrepancies that I was going to be okay with this. You know, I think the average person looking at this on a shelf who comes over and looking at my models is going to recognize it for what it is, or maybe not. They might not be familiar with the show, but the model isn't all that well known. In fact, there aren't really, as you see, a lot of even reference pictures of the original studio model. So I'm okay with having a model that's not, 100% accurate. I think people can recognize it for what it is if they're familiar with it from the TV show. Last thing I want to mention here is I did end up using a round 2 stand, as you can see, for the model. I just drilled a hole for the stand itself, for the post, and it works great. I just use an airbrush to make it look like clouds and sky. I may eventually design a more elaborate base for it to stand on. I was thinking it might be nice to have something that looks like cliffs or a rocky sort of scene underneath it, but maybe I might do something like that as I get closer to a model show. Alright guys, well that's going to do it for now. I hope you enjoyed following along. This really was a unique, fun project to share with you guys. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me here on my YouTube channel or at illustratedmodeler@gmail.com. Coming up on the channel then will be a painting video. This is something I've talked about a few times on the channel. It's going to go over how I created oil painting from point A to Z, and because I do have some paintings I'm trying to finish up here for San Diego Comic-Con, so that will be coming up on the channel soon. I also have another segment which I'll be telling you guys about soon here that's going to be something new for the channel, but I'll elaborate that on a future video coming up. soon here as well. And lastly, have a great show, you guys who are attending Wonderfest. That's coming up pretty fast here. I certainly will miss seeing you guys. As I mentioned, I have some traveling to do during that time, but I hope to make it again there next year, and certainly look forward to seeing the videos that are going to be posted about Wonderfest. As always, a lot of wonderful things to see there. All right, guys, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.